the story of our work. And it's another story about getting lost as an organization. It's a story of an organization that tried to do everything right and yet was not able to succeed. One that was recognized as being the best in the world and still was not able to achieve the outcome that it saw that it needed to achieve. So I'm going to go right to that story when Nicholas Yu is presenting to our organization the United Nations 40 Best Practices in the World. He flies in from Nairobi, very large community celebration. The city had it in their most historic building. They felt very strongly about this one because we had worked very hard as a city on becoming a community that really understood people who were living in poverty. And we really tried to focus differently on working with them. Matter of fact, the Economic Development Department used to take me out on talks with them. And these are talks to big corporations. And they would say, this is a special place, this city of Waterloo. And we are the Economic Development Department. We sell municipal land, we make things good for business, da-da-da-da-da-da. And it helps about 80% of our population do really well. But about 20% of our population doesn't benefit from what we do. Just think about that for a moment. What a radical recognition that 20% of the population doesn't benefit from the system that we have created for economic development. Now, what's so interesting is that, when I got 80% in school, I was pretty happy. And when I think of us as a human system, a Canadian human system, and I think that we're getting it 80% right, 80% of the time, I think that says something really remarkable. It also means that how we work into the future has to be somewhat different, because we're actually now taking a student from 80 to 90. We're not going from 50 or 45. We get it. We know what to do. We've just got to get better, because 80 isn't good enough when it comes to people. So, we have this ceremony, and I get called forward to accept the award. And I do all the right things. Darren, you know what that's like. You have to make sure everybody gets praise and that the right words are said to the right people. And then I did something that to this day is controversial in our community. I said, I find it very interesting that we're being recognized here today. On the one hand, it makes sense. We've now put over 5,500 people back to work. We've gone through the worst part of free trade, in which most of our American corporations have left. Thousands of employees have been displaced, and we've created a team that can go into a workplace, and it can actually place 98% of the workers into jobs before our career action centers close in every one of those factories. Before we went into that work, the community average was 52% placement. We had upped that to 98%. We had all kinds of community programs, and most importantly, we had set up a small business program in which we had helped 1,200 small businesses to get started. All of those individuals had been unemployed or on welfare before we started working with them. Now, the thing that was most remarkable about that, and the thing that I'm most proud of, is that KPMG came and did a study after we had been operating for 7 years, that self-employment program. And their analysis was to be how many of those businesses survived beyond 5 years. They came back with 81.2% of those businesses survived 5 years. We had our own chamber of commerce for those businesses. We had buying clubs for those businesses. We had $1 million loan fund before there were loan funds in Canada for small businesses like that. And we'd been starting to work with banks and transferring all of those loans over. So you can see in many ways why we were giving this recognition. But I said, I find it very interesting that we're getting this award today. I said, you see, we've been entering into a new campaign. And this campaign helps us to look at poverty differently. And so what we've done with that is we started working with the private sector. And one of the things I learned from the private sector is that when you lose shareholder wealth, you're actually fired, not recognized. I says, well, there's another way of looking at all the work we've done. And the reality is, even though we're being recognized today as one of the best organizations of our kind in the world, poverty in this region has actually increased by 5% in the last 10 years. So to be honest with you, I think you should probably fire me today, not be recognizing me. And I left the stage. You can see why that didn't go over so well. But I was making a point. And the point really was that it's not only about doing things right. And it's not only about being the best. It's about a community system. And it's about improving that community system for the people that we have set out to serve. And that was important to us in our new thinking. We were trying now, this is where we got lost. Because all of my training, all of my thinking, all of my leadership had been the kind of leadership that I was the rider on the white horse. And if I got up there and I led my people forward and we just did it, and we didn't just do it, but we did it better than everybody else, we were going to succeed. And we did, as an agency. But what happens when you look back and you look at your trail and you've done everything right, and yet the result that you most want did not come forward with you? What do you do? Whose fault is that? And of course, the debate in the community was furious. Not furious as in angry, furious as in bold and continuous. Because people were asking, why then do these results not occur? And that's when we came up with this idea of Opportunities 2000. And that's when we came up with the idea of a millennium campaign to say, what if we all work together as a community? What if we pulled together in a way that we've never pulled together before, and all of us work together? The private sector, the voluntary sector, government, and yes, people living in poverty. What if we first of all created a leadership roundtable that was made up of all 4 sectors? 4 sectors, you say? There's only 3 sectors. Voluntary, government, private. Well, the business sector said there's the client. And the client needs to be at the table. And in this case, the client were people living in poverty. So now what we had to do is figure out, how do we create a leadership roundtable in which all 4 of these sectors, including people living in poverty, just didn't have voice, but all had power. And how do you actually make it work when you have your top business leaders, which is what we did, with our top bankers, our top corporate leads, our top industries, they were at the table. Then we had all levels of government, at the CAO level, at the mayor level. Then we had, at the voluntary sector, our most prestigious voluntary sector organizations. And then we had 4 people living in poverty. You can see how that worked. So it became somewhat messy. And what was interesting is that the 4 people living in poverty, every time they spoke, it wasn't that they weren't respected. It's just that they were talking from story instead of from power. And so everybody here, though that they were very empathic, they always felt a little bit sorry for the 4. So we had to figure out, first of all, even how to give power to these 4. And so what we did is we appointed a staff position. we created an advisory council of 50 people who were living in poverty, and the leadership team said, we don't want any major decision to come through this council that hasn't first been vetted by this poverty council of 50 people. So we had this whole process of creating a dialogue amongst our people living in poverty, in your case learners, it would be here, that would be able to then bring forth, and so the 4 people that were at the leadership team now had a lot of power. And when they spoke, they actually spoke on behalf of the 50 people who had processed in depth the issues that we were working on. Anyway, that's what we started to do. And we had really no idea. So we were lost at 2 levels. One was the fact that we thought this is how you do work. This is what it meant to be the best. When we realized, okay, we still want to be the best at how we do the work of reducing poverty, but we know that it's not giving us the result that we had wanted. So we were lost that way, right? On the other hand, we were now trying to form a new process, and the only thought we had is that we all have to work together. And we all have to change a little bit. And we even started to think this thought, maybe it's less important for any one organization to be the best than it is for a whole community to change just a little bit. Maybe if we all just change a little bit, we would have a greater result. And so we asked the private sector, what do you want to do? And we had a campaign that we went through all of the chambers of commerce. We had 4 of them in our area. We had a high-tech chamber of commerce, and we went and worked with them. And we asked them, what do they want to do? 52 corporations came forward and ran projects, amazing types of projects and ideas. Of course, they also gave lots and lots of money. We raised about $5 million in a very short period of time from them for this work. And we accepted no money from government because we basically said to government that you're not a very good partner when it comes to this. We would much rather you give us your people. We think that you have a lot more talent in government and that it's more valuable than money, and that your talent is actually being wasted. So give us as much of your talent as possible, and we'll work with them. And after 2 years, we'll accept your money if you stay true to your promise of giving us your talent and freeing them up to do the work that needs to be done. So just another thing, we were lost in this, right? We knew that something had to change, and we knew that every time we took government money, we were doing it their way instead of the way that we now were feeling it needed to be done, right? So I know that that's, that's messy, and it's messy territory. It was a remarkable time for us, and we learned a tremendous amount. By the time year 2000 came along, we had helped just over 1,700 families. Our goal was 2,000 by 2000, which is what would have made us the lowest. Within 6 months, we were at 2,300. 6 months past 2,000, we were at 2,300 families, and we kept growing. Interestingly enough, shortly thereafter, a group of philanthropists came forward and said, we want to see this grow across the country. And so we gathered together 15 organizations, and we started to have a conversation about what this might mean and how it is that we might grow this into other cities. Calgary was there. And right now, by the way, you have an initiative here called Vibrant Calgary. And Momentum was there. Walter Hostley and his team, many of you know him. And we started to talk. And one of the big things that they wanted us to describe was, how do you do this? How do you enter into a system? And how do you bring about change? And that system is really the system of poverty reduction, but the system is really a city. How do you enter into a city and bring about change? And we agreed that we were going to work together as these 15 cities, and we were going to try to work 5 ways. And I want to share these 5 ways with you in hopes that it might be also relevant to your journey. The first thing was, it's about changing the measure. Changing the measure. And so in our case, we said, we want less poor, not better poor. And what we actually understood, do you realize that you cannot get charitable status in Canada for reducing poverty? You can only get charitable status for alleviating the effects of poverty. Because the reduction of poverty is to imply that there's individual benefit being received. So that is not charitable. I was on the committee with Revenue Canada that at least what we do is we have a community economic development paper that we've now written so that community economic development organizations could get charitable status. Very, very interesting. But it just shows you that we've created a system in Canada for reducing poverty that is about alleviating it. And we have this sense that poverty is temporal, which in some cases it is, right? In most cases it actually is, right? But in temporal, what we're essentially assuming is that the current economic system is the kind of economic system that will absorb everyone. So it is completely good and healthy. And therefore, when people are unemployed, they are unemployed or they are poor out of their own life circumstance. And if we can just help them through that life circumstance, this healthy, robust system that's good for 100% of the people is just going to absorb them and take them on. You get it? Well, guess what? We said no. That system isn't as robust as we all think it is. It's a damn good system, right? I'm a capitalist through and through, right? I love free enterprise, right? They call me a socialist capitalist. There used to be progressive conservatives in this country, so I always thought it'd be okay to be a socialist capitalist. But we recognized that this was not the case. So we wanted to change the measure. So we asked that question today. What's your measure? What does it mean to change? What do you really want for your learners? And it's not just something that I would ask of the college. I would ask of every one of you in your jobs. And I would ask that of every one of you in your classrooms. What's the measure of success? What's the measure of excellence? Think about that for a while. And so we recognize that there will be several measures, but one of them needs to be a comprehensive measure. And that took us to our second point. And that's why I was so taken by this notion of a comprehensive college. Because our second point was to work comprehensively, right? For us, what that meant was see the whole. See the whole of what is going on. Margaret Wheatley tells this story. Anybody read her? Leadership in the New Science. It's one of those difficult books, but it is one of the best books to read. She's a biologist that looks at living systems. And she tries to understand, what do living systems tell us about leadership? She wrote a second book called The Simpler Way. That's my favorite. And the simpler way is saying there's got to be a simpler way. And if we just followed nature and learned from nature about how things are naturally, and we followed that, things would be simpler. And she translates all of this back into leadership. Well, she's teaching at the Stanford School of Medicine. And I didn't know this, but the Stanford School of Medicine has more Nobel Prizes than any country. It's an amazing school. And I'm told it's built in a big circle. And in the middle of that circle, there's a park. And so you can walk around the circle. And that's what Meg did during one of her breaks. Meg is a good friend. And as she walked around that circle, every one of the buildings that she walked by was named after a different piece of the human anatomy. So there was the foot, and there was the head, and there were the eyes, there was the back, you know, and it goes on and on. You can just imagine, right? And she comes to the middle of the park, and she stands there, and she sort of looks around, and she goes, I really hope they're talking to each other. You see, I really hope they're talking to each other. Because it's one body. It's one human system. And so one of the things that we came to understand is that so much of the way that we deliver services, just take unemployment, for instance. Like, it's not a medical condition even. Matter of fact, it shouldn't be life-threatening, especially in Canada. It should be pretty basic. And yet, you become unemployed. And we used to give you a barrier matrix when you came to our organization. That person's a 7.2 barriers to employment. Or that person's only a 3.1. They'll have no problem getting a new job, right? And so the barriers might be around education, vocational training. They might be around, they need new clothes. They can't afford those. They don't have enough to eat. They don't have an income. They need income support, whatever it might be. Well, then what happens is, this was the genius of the system. We were one of the 7.1. We could deal with one, actually we could deal with 1.3 of the 7.1 barriers to employment ourselves. The rest we referred people out to. And of course, all of those referrals we got a little ticky for, right? So part of being the best was providing our 1.3 part of the problem, and the other part of the best was knowing who to send the person to. And I'm thinking to myself, what an insane system that sends someone to 6 or 7 different organizations, and all they are is unemployed. Another gentleman, we were working in Hamilton. Hamilton, the best place to raise a child, is one of our processes and projects. And the head of the Chamber of Commerce stood up. And the head of the Chamber of Commerce said, I find this work incredibly important, and I want to tell you a story. Now, we thought, as the head of the Chamber of Commerce, he was going to take on the agenda, and it was going to be a crass, pull up your bootstraps type of story, and that's what he wanted the project to be. But instead, he told this incredibly moving story of their child being diagnosed with a life-threatening disease, and immediately being appointed 7 organizations to work with. And how trying to find just reorganizing their life around those 7 organizations, it essentially destroyed their family. Their daughter lived. That was the most important part. But he just said, why did it have to be so hard? And why was it our family's job to coordinate? Can you imagine how you coordinate the schedule of 7 different agencies? So that was part of what the comprehensive conversation was all about. And so it was, as a system, we were starting to try to understand, how do you see the whole? How do we begin to work at the whole? And it's not just about partnership. It's actually about creating a system that works for people. And that was part of our conversation, and about how you've been trying to bring all of the elements of the needs of the learner into one place. And I would encourage that so much, including a lot of co-location here at the College of Services and Agencies. You are a city college. You are downtown. You are where people are. Bring them to one place. Let them be serviced in a very easy way. Let's make learning. Let's make vocational development. Let's make life development and quality of life and the growth that happens in people's lives easy for people. I love the saying, let's make it easy for people to do the right thing. In so many ways, that's our job. Change the measure. Work comprehensively. The third one was harnessing assets. This was an interesting one for us because many of us were from the John McKnight School of Development, ABCD, Asset-Based Community Development. Anybody know the work? Several of you do here. The president reads everything. It's wonderful. What that work essentially is it says that when you move into situations of stress or distress, low-income neighborhoods, you can find many assets in those neighborhoods. There are many things that are working in the midst of so much that is not working. And you take that to an individual or human level, we move to the positive psychology level. Many of you have been following the positive psychology movement. That essentially what it's saying is that, when we're supposed to deconstruct our history, it doesn't always benefit us to look at all the things that our parents did to us that make us the way we are. And so we're screwed up because of all these screwed up things that were done to us, right? And so I've always thought of that. That's kind of a strange way to heal people. And the positive psychology movement says, well, why don't we look at all the things that were done right? And let's embrace all of those. At least let's embrace them first. Let's not ignore all the other things, but let's embrace some of those. Well, that's essentially how asset-based community development works. And it was how we started to think about the work. Whenever we moved into a community, that's what we would do. So I'll just tell you a quick story. I'm going to Surrey, British Columbia. And they've asked me to do an assessment of the community. I'm there for an entire day. I come there in the morning and the community agencies take me on a tour. First thing they did is took me to the corner where the hookers hung out. I thought that was a strange place to go first, Then they took me to the needle exchange clinic. And I met people there. This is real life stuff that is happening. Of course, I didn't meet any of the people. Then I went to the low-income housing places, the places in Surrey that were all falling apart, right? And the woe that was being described to me about this place called Surrey, it confirmed for me, because I'd grown up in Abbotsford, British Columbia, and there were two armpits of British Columbia. One was Surrey, the other was Prince George, And so it just confirmed for me what I had grown up with. Well, in the afternoon, I am at, hey, you folks at the doors, if you want to come in and sit down, you can. Feel free. Come on in. There's lots of seats all over the place. You're not disturbing me. So, in the afternoon, the business leaders take me on a tour. Guess what? Surrey is the fastest growing municipality in all of British Columbia. They are building some of the most incredible buildings downtown, not just for business, but for the arts and library. Like gorgeous stuff for the community, right? The mayor is as proud as ever. Well, the only thing I got from the mayor is that there was some sort of war going on at the needle exchange clinic. And I was very perplexed at the end of the day. How did I get two completely different stories? So the strategy was then in the evening, all the people plus came together for a community gathering. And I told them this story, right? This is what I learned in the morning. This is what I learned in the afternoon. What's going on? And we had a real heart-to-heart, one that they didn't think we were going to have. And it was how we see our community. And it wasn't just about seeing the cup half full and half empty. It's not that simple, right? It's far deeper than that. It's about how we actually enter into the problem. Now, both ways, kind of the Pollyanna approach to social issues, and of course, this, I don't know how you want to describe it, the Armageddon approach, to community development. Both are not helpful. But what asset-based development says is it goes into a community and it asks the question, what's going right? What are the strengths here that I can work with? Now that's helpful in all situations. It's helpful for every manager in the room in terms of looking at your employees, right, your team, and saying, what strengths do I have in this team, right? And I want to bring those forward first. It's also when you walk into a classroom. Of course you have to teach something, but what are the strengths in that classroom that you can actually identify? And how do you actually do that part? How do you identify the strengths in the room? Right? How do you begin to form a conversation with the people in a room to see what it is that they have to offer? And then how do you then change your assignments in such a way that it becomes a strengths-based learning, where the learners with strengths can teach learners who don't have strengths in those areas. It's just an interesting way of thinking about that, but that's how we approach a lot of our work. And so what it did for us is it changed our model. Because our model was go into a situation, diagnose the problem, this is what we're good at, like doctors, fix the problem. And that's how the human service system is designed. That's what we're good at, right? In many ways we do the same with learners. Find out why they're not learning, help them to learn. Find out what they don't know, give them what they need to know. Right? So it's just an interesting entry point. The outcome is the same in this other way, but it is a very different entry point that gives one much more to work with when one says, what's working for that individual, right? What's working in that community? Now let's bring all of what's working together. And then let's start to talk about what we want to see changed. That's the interesting thing. Not what we want to fix, what we want to see changed. And so the discussions around poverty became discussions about the best place to raise a child, about creating vibrant communities, right? That's what it became, right? It became about opportunities. It became about social change and community change. It came about to say, we are already working at a certain level of excellence. How might we work better? That was our third one. Change the measure, work comprehensively, asset-based, and then the fourth one, multi-sector collaboration. This was an eye-opener for us because on the one hand, we knew it was about collaboration. What we didn't know is that it was about multi-sector collaboration. And that when we brought people living in poverty into the conversation, that itself changed everything. When we brought business into the conversation, that was primarily a conversation, and honestly, it wasn't a conversation between government and the voluntary sector. It was really government saying, this is what these are the funding programs we have, and the voluntary sector saying, thank you, thank you, thank you. You know, that was the conversation. And every once in a while, there was some sort of dialogue that said what should be done, and then a new program was formed, and then we all begged for the money again, right? It was this process that created those types of social programs. That when we did multi-sector collaboration, it suddenly had everyone sit in a room together. Private sector, people living in poverty. You know, what changes? Well, the first thing that changes, another lovely getting lost story. I can remember this meeting. Frank Mowat had lived on the streets for 15 years, came to his sister's wedding, and he decided he wanted to change his life. Came to our agency, and over a period of about 3 years, he turned around his drug addiction, he got his mental health issues under control, and had now already started 2 organizations for people who were homeless. An amazing leader. We're having this multi-sector leadership team, and he comes in the door, and he's got an oxygen tank on, and he's walking with a cane, and he walks up to me, and he says, Paul, he says, I don't know what I'm doing here. There's all these highfalutin people. He said, what do I have to contribute? What do I know? Of course, I was reassuring of Frank, and he trusted me, and I trusted him. And I said, Frank, you're going to make a big difference here. Not more than a minute later, Jim Gordon walks into the room. Jim Gordon's the vice president of our largest bank. Not only the bank, he's in charge of all the banks, for it was RBC Financial was our big partner. Very, very important member of our community. Blue suit, three-piece, just ironed, comes up to me, walks into the door, and he says, Paul, I don't know what the heck I'm doing here, he says. What do I know about poverty? And I thought to myself, yes, we have a discussion, right? And the discussion is starting at a place of not knowing, which is so incredibly important. Because if we enter into a multi-sector collaboration, if we enter into any collaboration, and the collaboration is about knowing, if that's our starting point, do what you've always done and get what you've always got. And that's what happens over and over and over again, right? What does Einstein say about doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result? And so much of our system is built on this, right? We enter into these discussions not getting lost, fearing that process, but rather we enter into it wanting to tell everyone what we know and how right we can be. And then we're hoping we can win with the most right idea. David Pico just died a couple of years ago. I considered him to be, he's the head of Boston Consulting, probably the smartest man in Canada. He formed the Toronto City Summit Alliance. And what he basically said is, this city is not going anywhere fast. Well, those in Calgary who looked at Toronto always knew that. But he said, we got to do something, and we can't rely on government to do it. And he created this Toronto City Summit Alliance. And he brought me in, even though I wasn't from the city, he brought me in as an expert to be part of certain roundtables. And I was mesmerized by David's technique. Because what he would do is he would bring all of these leaders into the room. And I remember being in a room one time with Bob Ray and John Tory and key Canadian leaders. And they had all committed to being at this table as long as it took. And in that case, we were looking at this minute little clause, this minute little period, the 6 months after someone leaves welfare. And we were going to work at this as long as it took for us to understand why the recidivism rate is so high at that period. Well, it was very interesting. I'll tell you the result that we found. First thing he does is he gets us to ask all of our questions. So we spend an enormous amount of time, 3 meetings actually, just getting all of our questions onto the table. What are the questions we have? And then he would talk about those. And we would talk about the questions as questions. We didn't try to answer them. And then at another point, he would send institutes like us off to do research on the questions, and we would bring it back. And then we spent another enormous number of meetings hearing back from experts on these questions. So I said to David, I think that's really smart. What you're doing here is you're trying to really get a comprehensive understanding of what's going on, and that helps us then to work together. He said, well, you got one part of that right. He said, look, we can use any technique, but at the end of the day, the most important thing we have to do is we have to get off of our chests our questions. That's really important. And secondly, we all have to have a common experience. So he says at some point we have to get lost together so that we have a common experience of finding the same thing together. Does that make so much sense? It's so intuitive that you're not going to actually come together in your knowing. You've got to go on some sort of journey together so that you come to something that you now have a common understanding and a common set of beliefs together. Anyway, fascinating process. Multi-sector collaboration. And it doesn't work, what we found, is when you just want to bring some of those sectors together. Matter of fact, I would be really hard-pressed now to pull any meeting together that didn't have the four. Matter of fact, in our church, they wanted to discuss homosexuality. And it was so interesting. I boycotted it because they didn't want to have any homosexuals in the room because they thought they might be uncomfortable. I'm looking at them with this absolute unbelief. How are you going to talk about homosexuality without any homosexuals in the room? Right? Anyway, they didn't get me. I didn't go to church for a very long time until they were done. Yeah. Anyway. And then the last one, learning and change. Change the measure, think comprehensively and work comprehensively. Harness your assets. Multi-sector collaboration and learning and change. You know, when we accept a vibrant community, we commit to giving them $1 million over a certain number of years. In the letter, Tim Broadhead, the CEO of the largest foundation in our country, he writes them a letter, and in that letter, we actually write the letter, he signs it, but it comes from him. He says, congratulations on all the right things. Then he says, congratulations on writing your community plan. Now, the community plans take about 18 months to write, because what we expect is a city to get lost for a while so that they can come through that cycle and come up with really creative ideas. And just to show you how well that works, we now have 164 social innovations around poverty reduction happening in this country. 164 coming through a process of getting lost and thinking outside the box. They, in the letter he says, congratulations on writing your plan, but just wanted to let you know that if you implement it, we will consider you a failure. So he's investing $1 million in a plan that if it gets implemented, he will consider it a failure. It's our way of saying to every one of these organizations, just because you have a plan, right, it doesn't mean it's the right one. It's what you know now. It's what you know now. And if you start working your plan, imagine what you're going to know a year from now. That's what we want you to implement. And then a year from then, we want you to say, what do we know now? And that's what we want you to implement. And so what we do then with every one of our communities, we do a theory of change. So we ask the questions right at the beginning. Who are you? What's the change you want to see? What's your theory of how that change occurs? Now what are you going to do? And of course, that last one, what are you going to do, has to be consistent with your theory of change, has to be consistent with the change that you want to see for your clients. That's always a killer. Because it's often people say, what's the change I want to see for my organization or for the institutions? No. We'll work at that. But it's got to come, first of all, what's the change that what's the big change you want in the world? Right? And then that defines, again, back who you are. And we do that every year. And it just takes a half a day with the key stakeholders. It's a very interesting process of reflecting and planning forward. And it's taking stock. Now you can imagine over a period of 7 to 10 years, that's how long we fund these organizations. Over that period of time, you can see how, it's actually exactly 9:15. Huh? That's my buzzer? No, it's actually not. Isn't it uncanny? I'm done, right? But you can see that over that period of time, the genius that begins to occur. And you have all 7 of these theories of change lined up beside each other, and you see your evolution. And for us, it becomes part of how we evaluate the success of these projects. How much did they grow? How much did they learn? How many new innovations are they bringing forward through that process of continuous learning and changing? You've got a long day ahead of you, and I could talk for a very long time about our work and about the ideas. Thank you for drawing the passion out of me, because it's really the work that you do that does that. The work that you do every day in creating a city that is not just a great city, but it's great for everyone. Thank you.